Okay, in part three of this week's course content, we're looking at consumer culture and capitalism. And what I'm going to do is focus on some of the key ideas of the Frankfurt School. Essentially, this section will look at very critical ideas of what consumer culture and popular culture mean for the kind of, I suppose, existence of humans, the way that we, in this perspective, are alienated and follow kind of ideology, capitalist ideology. So there's some key terms to consider to think about this. Firstly is the notion of materialism, where the idea of a good life, in this sense, is attached to having lots of stuff, having a big house in the right place, having the right car, having good objects, collecting things and all that kind of stuff. So materialism in this sense is connected consumerism, and these Marxist theorists argue that capitalism kind of subdues people through the rituals of consumerism. The products that we kind of want to buy, that we're obsessed with, that we feel give us status and give us pleasure, from this perspective, these things are kind of manipulating us to have a false consciousness, to desire things over kind of experiences, to desire things over creativity. In this sense, consumerism replaces kind of class consciousness in a way, and loyalty to brands replaces political loyalties or political activities. So this moves to the idea that people in capitalism are kind of what they call a commodified self. You kind of are what you consumed, and our self-identities are shaped and understood through these consumption practices. Our self-identity and our social identity, so we kind of relate to other people through these things too. In terms of what consumer culture means, in terms of why we do it, the notions of hedonism and commodity fetishism are important for this. Hedonism is the idea that life is about being devoted to pleasure and happiness, and this is done through commodity fetishism in this Marxist critique. And hedonism here is kind of all about instant gratification over kind of long-term gratification. Commodity fetishism occurs when people become kind of harmfully obsessed with consumer objects. The idea that the things you own come to own you. They enslave those who possess them. From this point of view, the kind of orientation towards commodities, even though we're kind of choosing to do it, is kind of denying our autonomy, because we're losing sight of what these Marxist critics argue are the real things that matter. So that's a kind of introduction to the critical theoretical point of view towards consumer culture. At the end of this slide, there's a link to a really, what I think still, while slightly dated, but a really interesting and kind of right-on animation about consumer culture. It connects problems of production and consumption to alienation and also to environmental problems. So if you're interested in finding out a bit more of that aspect of consumer culture, have a look at that now, stop the lecture and come back. So these ideas are founded from the Frankfurt School, really famous critical theorists, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Benjamin. There's some others too, like Erich Fromm, and next generation, like Jürgen Habermas. These kind of philosophers in many ways, although they were doing kind of social research as well, are neo-Marxists. They develop Marx's ideas, and they kind of, their concern is, okay, this is like the middle of the 20th century now, why hasn't a Marxist revolution happened like he predicted? And they believe that things like consumer culture and pop culture are kind of things that sedate the masses in that sense. So they're kind of acknowledging here that Marx's work doesn't really adequately, completely explain the complexities of 20th century life, but they're still heavily influenced by Marx's ideas, his critical approach, and they're interested in kind of making life better and looking for social change to move towards that. So the quote there from Adorno, "We are living in a cultural cage where something is provided for all, so none may escape." And so you can see there's a kind of, I suppose, almost what seems like a contradiction here. These critical theorists argue that consumer culture and pop culture provide many things that give us leisure and pleasure and make us happy. But they're making an argument that we kind of have a false consciousness here, that those feelings of joy and happiness and conviviality and these kind of things that maybe come through these practices, going to sporting things, going to concerts, buying music, watching Netflix, whatever, while they may give us pleasure in some immediate sense, the critical theorists argue that these things are kind of making us ideologically kind of stupefied. We're not paying attention to the real things that matter. That is, that we're being exploited, in labour market relations. And more recently, critical theorists may argue that, we're ignoring things like the environment and climate change, and we're just kind of watching TV as the kind of world burns. So you can see here this is a kind of very much a critical attitude towards the way of life under capitalism. And that essentially one of the things they argue is that the culture industries, and you can think here of the gaming industry, the movies industries, the music industry, all these kind of large-scale things that produce popular culture. These are the key drivers of what this ideological kind of false consciousness comes from. So these practices of consumption kind of, in some ways, mitigate alienation in that we kind of go to work, we get tired, and we come home and sit in front of Netflix for so many hours. But really, they're therefore also an expression of it in many ways. So these things are also a distraction. So therefore, rather than focusing on our unfair and alienated and exploitative working conditions, we kind of go shopping and watch TV to kind of switch off from those problems. So for the likes of Adorno and Horkheimer, these things distract us. They kind of distract us from developing a collective consciousness, organising, to try and make the world better. A key term that Adorno developed about this is pseudo-individualisation, and I think this is quite a useful way to think about everyday life and the things that we buy. Adorno argues basically that consumer culture sells us the same thing, I suppose, over and over again. And you could see earlier on there was like on this, the iPhone is essentially very similar. It's the same kind of thing over and over again, just a little bit kind of changed. Pseudo-individualisation kind of involves endowing cultural mass production with the halo of free choice. And again, you can see here the challenge to the kind of structure agency thing here. They're kind of challenging the idea of choice in this system. So you can see the little kind of graphy thing there. It's a bit of a meme, but like it points out that many of the narratives of movies are pretty much exactly the same, and we kind of know this, right? And it's comfortable, and you kind of just consume these things anyway. Their key critique of popular culture, therefore, is that it doesn't express human creativity; it stifles it. That these things are made for money, not art. And that popular culture itself stifles more serious, critical forms of artistic expression. Also, these things become very formulaic. I've used the washing powder thing before. You go to a supermarket, there's whole aisles of things, but essentially are the same things in different coloured packets. Most pop songs are very formulaic. They go verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end. There's the endless sequels to movies and endless Marvel and superhero films. I think, the current kind of Batman movies, it must be about the 15th version of them. Even TV shows, Law and Order, they're just making a new one in a different city. So these things relate to both the kind of lack of creativity in terms of what the Frankfurt School consider consumer and pop culture, but they also relate to the way that things are produced in terms of planned and perceived obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is the idea that things are kind of made to break, and we have to buy new things all the time. There's a lot of waste involved with that. And perceived obsolescence is the idea that even though things could be perfectly fine, there's kind of things like status and fashion that make us kind of want to buy the new things. So for these Marxist critical theorists, pop culture is a real stifling thing for human beings. And it's important here that all pop culture is the same. From the Frankfurt School point of view, you can't kind of treat other people's pop culture as being stifling and cultural dupe and your own stuff as being radical. In this, or resistive or subversive, in this analysis, things, a band like, say, the rock punk band like Rage Against the Machine that like actually sing with Marxist lyrics. In many ways, that's just capitalism selling back its own subversion to the masses. By listening to that, album of, where they kind of critique the government or whatever, and critique war and critique consumer culture. From this point of view, really, we're not doing anything. We're just kind of listening and maybe feeling good about ourselves. Geez, I'm so political because I'm into Rage Against the Machine. But in the end, no one's actually doing anything to changing things. We're just listening to a song. So pseudo-individualisation here and the kind of products of the culture industry are, very much a problem in terms of people, therefore, organising and, revolting to have a better life. So that's the kind of critical theory from Marxist school, very Marxist perspective, very quickly summed up. From a more Weberian perspective, George Ritz's really famous notion of McDonaldization uses Weber's work to think about what was happening in the 80s and 90s around the rise of McDonald's. And again, this is a kind of way of thinking about broader issues in pop and consumer culture. So Ritz developed this idea of McDonaldization, and he argued that the model of McDonald's at the time was becoming increasingly the norm across the way things were sold to us and franchising and things like that. And you can see the rise of Starbucks as a good example. And there was then the Starbuckization of society as well, was another theory. But Ritzer says there's kind of 4 key things that happen in this model. And again, he's following the Weberian idea that societies are being rationalised and becoming bureaucratic in various ways, which leads to more predictability. So there's control, efficiency, calculability, and predictability are the 4 things that make up McDonaldization. Control is around the way things are made, of the worker. Efficiency is like the way the machines do more and more of the work. In fact, in McDonald's, the customer does a lot of work. There's calculability, the Big Mac, the fact that you know how much you're going to consume every time you go in terms of the different sizes of things. And predictability, the McDonald's are largely the same around the world. Now, this isn't just a kind of way of looking at fast food or pop culture or consumption. The problem with this is that this kind of rationality starts to leak into education systems and health systems and art and other areas. So there's been analysis done of education systems about the McDonaldization of it, how, you come to university now and you don't really read books anymore, you just read small snippets of things. Or an example in terms of the calculability of education is that you can go to school for 13 years or whatever and you come out with this kind of score after all that time that gets you into uni or not. It's like a calculable thing rather than something that expresses more about, the emotional journey or the things that you learned along the way. McDonaldization also leads to kind of, who dies and who doesn't as well in terms of like waiting lists and stuff like that in health systems. And the more and more they become like bureaucratic systems, the more likely they are they actually become somewhat inefficient. And Ritzer calls these things the irrationality of rationality. What Ritzer points out is that these systems come to kind of eat themselves in various ways. So they develop a drive-through system to, go through really quickly, but then become more popular. And in fact, now it's often kind of slower to go through the drive-through. Importantly, these kind of organisational things for Ritzer also lead to different human relations, what he calls dehumanised and de-enchanted kind of relations. So by knowing when you go into a place like McDonald's exactly what you're going to get, really everyday life becomes a little bit de-enchanted. It becomes safe and predictable and boring and conformist. Dehumanising also in terms of the kind of way that people relate into those systems, particularly the idea of false friendliness. McDonald's staff are taught to kind of be happy and, upsell and all that kind of stuff. The customer kind of knows this. And so they, in terms of that Goffman-esque kind of performance of everyday self, there's an extra layer of fakeness going on there that dehumanises relationships between people in those situations. So Ritz's work is really fun to read, so I suggest you check it out. I think the book Modernization of Society must be into its 12th edition now, and there's been other versions of it as well, such as the Disneyization of society and things like that. But they're kind of, I think, useful, relatively simple conceptual devices to think about how globalization, consumer culture, and particularly the way that it's been Americanized, has produced a lot of sameness around the world. There's critiques of this as well around notions of hybridity that I'll touch upon in the last lecture recording. Also, if you're interested in aspects of this, see the pop art of Ron English. He has some, as in the thing on the side there, some really interesting kind of graphic art around McDonaldization and Disney and stuff like that. And in terms of thinking a little about consumer culture and the waste that happens in it, check out the work of Chris Jordan, and I've got some links there to kind of look at that. Chris Jordan makes these kind of photos that actually, when you can't start bearing down to the minute level, they're kind of, made out of, soda pop cans, and it's like, 12,000 soda pop cans make this image, and that's how many are kind of wasted a day in America or whatever. So, if you're interested in that, kind of check that out.